My niece threw my 4-year-old daughter's birthday cake on the floor and said, "Eat it off the ground." The whole table agreed. When she laid down to blow the candle, my niece slammed her head into the cake, causing her to lose consciousness. I confronted them, saying, "She's just a girl, how can you let her do this?" Everyone said, "Relax, it's just a joke." While my sister grabbed her hair and started lifting her unconscious face and smirked, saying, "She's matching your ugly face now." That's when my mother said, "She had her share, now you lick it off from her face." Everyone laughed. I grabbed my daughter and tried to leave. My parents shouted, "Before leaving, clean all this mess." My sister rushed to the door and said, "Finish what you started." But they had no idea what I would do next. The weight of my daughter Emma's limp body in my arms felt like carrying the shattered pieces of everything I tried to protect her from. Frosting smeared across her unconscious face mixed with the tears streaming down mine as I pushed past my sister Victoria at the doorway. Her smug expression hadn't faded even after what she'd let her daughter Madison do. I didn't clean their mess. I didn't finish anything. I walked out of that house with Emma cradled against my chest, her shallow breathing the only sound louder than my mother's shouts behind me. The October air hit us like a slap, cold and sharp, but I welcomed it. Anything to get away from the poisonous atmosphere I'd subjected my baby to. The emergency room fluorescent lights made everything worse. A doctor named Dr. Richardson examined Emma while I sat in a plastic chair, my hands shaking so violently I had to clasp them together. "Mild concussion," he said. "Lucky it wasn't worse." Lucky. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. There was nothing lucky about what happened. My 4-year-old daughter had been assaulted at her own birthday party, and I'd stood there arguing with monsters instead of immediately calling the police. Dr. Richardson asked careful questions. How did this happen? Were there witnesses? Did anyone try to stop it? His eyes held something I recognized, concern that went beyond medical protocol. When I explained, his jaw tightened. A nurse named Patricia who'd been adjusting Emma's pillow stopped moving entirely. The silence stretched until Dr. Richardson spoke again, his voice professional but edged with something harder. He documented everything, he told me. Every injury. Every detail I'd shared. These records would matter if I chose to pursue action. Emma woke up confused and crying. She didn't understand where we were or why her head hurt. She asked if Grandma was still mad at her for getting the floor dirty. My heart splintered into smaller pieces than I thought possible. I held her and lied, telling her everything would be okay, that we were safe now, that nobody was mad at her. The lies came easier than the truth, that her own family had hurt her deliberately and found it entertaining. A social worker visited while we were still in the hospital. Her name was Deborah Santos, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a notepad she kept flipping through. Dr. Richardson had filed a mandatory report given Emma's injuries and the circumstances I described. Deborah asked questions gently but thoroughly. Was this the first incident? Had Madison shown aggression toward Emma before? Did other family members intervene or encourage the behavior? I answered everything honestly, my voice mechanical from exhaustion. Yes, there had been smaller incidents before. No, nobody had ever intervened meaningfully. Yes, my family had a pattern of treating Emma as lesser, disposable, worthy of mockery. Saying it all out loud to a stranger made the reality sharper somehow. These weren't just difficult family dynamics. This was systematic mistreatment of a child, and I'd enabled it by maintaining contact. Deborah took extensive notes. She explained that while she wouldn't be removing Emma from my care, I clearly protected her by leaving and seeking medical attention. The incident would be documented. If Madison showed similar behavior toward other children, this record would matter. If Victoria failed to address her daughter's violence, this record would matter. Everything mattered now in ways it hadn't before. "You did the right thing bringing her here," Deborah had said before leaving. A lot of parents try to minimize family incidents. They worry about causing trouble. But your daughter's safety is more important than family peace. Her words had settled into my chest like stones, heavy and grounding. Family peace. I'd sacrificed so much for that illusion over the years. Emma's comfort at gatherings. My own dignity. Daniel's patience with people who treated him like he wasn't good enough. All for peace that was really just silence about cruelty. We stayed overnight for observation. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the dark hospital room and let myself remember things I'd spent years trying to forget. Growing up as the second daughter in the Brooks family meant understanding your place. Victoria had been the golden child, beautiful and bold and mean in ways that made our parents laugh rather than discipline her. I'd been quieter, softer, the one who absorbed cruelty and learned to smile through it because causing scenes made everything worse. When I married Daniel 6 years ago, my family barely showed up to the wedding. Too small, my mother had said. Too simple. Victoria had spent the entire reception making comments about my dress being too tight and Daniel being too working class. He managed a hardware store, not a Fortune 500 company. He had rough hands from honest work. To them, this meant I'd married down and confirmed their suspicions about my lack of worth. Daniel had wanted to cut contact back then. He'd seen how they treated me at family dinners, the casual insults disguised as concern, the way they'd give Victoria's opinions weight while dismissing mine entirely. But I convinced him we could manage limited contact. I'd believed, stupidly, that having Emma might change things. Grandchildren sometimes soften people. Sometimes being an aunt made mean girls grow into kinder women. How spectacularly wrong I'd been. The incidents had started small after Emma was born. Comments about her features: she had my nose, which meant it was unfortunately prominent according to my mother. Remarks about her personality: too sensitive, too clingy, too needy of attention. Victoria's daughter Madison, 2 years older than Emma, could do no wrong despite being the most spoiled, vicious child I'd ever encountered. When Madison pushed Emma off a swing at a family gathering last year, Victoria had laughed and said Emma needed to learn to hold on better. I'd started limiting visits after that. But birthdays felt different. Birthdays were supposed to be sacred, special, safe. Emma had been so excited about turning 4, about having family come celebrate with her. She'd helped me pick out decorations, purple and silver, her favorite colors. She'd chosen a vanilla cake with buttercream frosting and asked if we could have princess plates. The party had started normally enough. We'd set everything up in my parents' dining room because their house was bigger than our apartment. Daniel had to work a shift he couldn't get coverage for, so I'd been alone with Emma. Victoria arrived with Madison and her husband Greg, who spent most of his time on his phone ignoring everyone. My parents had made their usual entrance, my mother immediately criticizing how I'd arranged the presents and my father grunting something about the noise level before retreating to his study. Madison had circled Emma like a shark from the moment she arrived. She'd grabbed toys Emma was playing with, knocked over the carefully stacked presents, and dumped juice on the tablecloth. Every time I tried to redirect her, Victoria would snap at me to stop being controlling. My mother backed her up, saying kids needed to work things out themselves. Translation: Emma needed to accept whatever Madison dished out. The cake had been the centerpiece of everything. I'd ordered it from a local bakery, splurging on something nicer than we could usually afford because I wanted Emma's day to be perfect. It was decorated with edible flowers and had her name written in purple icing. When I brought it out, Emma's eyes had gone wide with wonder. She'd clapped her little hands together and bounced in her seat with pure joy. Madison had other plans. "That cake is stupid," she'd announced loudly. "It looks like baby cake." "Madison, that's not nice," I'd said, keeping my voice gentle. "Emma really likes it." "Emma's a baby," Madison had shot back, glaring at my daughter with real malice in her 6-year-old eyes. "Babies eat off the floor." Before I could respond, before I could even process what was happening, Madison had grabbed the cake stand and shoved it. The beautiful cake toppled, sliding across the table before crashing to the floor in an explosion of frosting and sponge. The sound seemed to echo forever. Emma had gasped, her little face crumpling. She'd looked at me with devastated eyes, not understanding why someone would destroy something meant for her. I'd started moving toward the wreckage when Madison delivered her next blow. "Eat it off the ground," she'd shouted, pointing at Emma. "You're a baby, so eat it like one." I'd expected someone to intervene. My mother, my father, Victoria, anyone. Instead, my mother had chuckled. My father had looked over from his plate of appetizers and shrugged. Victoria had smiled encouragingly at Madison like she'd done something clever. "Come on, Emma," Victoria had said in a mockingly sweet voice. "Madison gave you a new way to eat your cake. Aren't you going to try it?" "This isn't funny," I'd said, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. That was her birthday cake. Madison destroyed it deliberately. "Kids will be kids," my mother had responded dismissively. "Stop being so dramatic, Jennifer. We can order another one." "She's 4 years old. This was supposed to be her special day." "And you're making it worse by overreacting," Victoria had chimed in. Madison was just playing around. I'd knelt down next to Emma, who was crying now, quiet tears rolling down her cheeks. She'd reached for me and I'd pulled her close, trying to shield her from the nightmare our family had become. My mind raced through options: leave immediately, try to salvage the party somehow, confront them more forcefully. While I held Emma, Victoria had been whispering something to Madison. I caught fragments: Show her, do it, they can't tell you what to do. My stomach had twisted with dread. Let's at least sing happy birthday, I'd said desperately, trying to find some piece of normalcy. I can light candles on what's left of the cake. I'd gathered the least destroyed section of cake from the floor and put it on a plate. It looked pathetic, a demolished mess of what should have been beautiful. But I'd stuck 4 candles in it anyway because what else could I do? Emma had been too upset to protest. When I lit the candles and started singing, my voice alone filled the room. Nobody joined me. They sat there watching like spectators at something mildly amusing. Emma had leaned forward to blow out her candles. Her little face, still wet with tears, had shown determination to complete this birthday ritual despite everything. She'd closed her eyes and taken a breath. Madison had struck like a snake. She'd lunged across the table and slammed both hands down on the back of Emma's head, driving her face first into the cake plate with brutal force. The crack of impact would haunt me forever. Emma's small body had gone completely limp, collapsing onto the table amid the wreckage of her birthday. I'd screamed. The sound had come from somewhere primal, a mother's terror made audible. I grabbed Emma, pulling her back from the table, but she wasn't responding. Her eyes were closed. Frosting covered her face like a grotesque mask. She was breathing but unconscious. What is wrong with you? I'd shouted at Madison, at all of them. She's just a girl, how can you let her do this? Relax, it's just a joke. Victoria had said, actually laughing. Kids play rough sometimes. Relax? Relax? She's unconscious. My mother had waved her hand dismissively. She's probably just being dramatic like her mother. That was when Victoria had done something I still couldn't fully process. She'd walked over, grabbed Emma's hair, and lifted my daughter's unconscious, frosting-covered face up. She'd looked at it and smirked, meeting my eyes with deliberate cruelty. She's matching your ugly face now, she'd said, her voice bright with malicious joy. Laughter had erupted around the table. My own mother had joined in, stepping closer to examine Emma's limp form like she was an interesting specimen. She had her share, my mother had said, gesturing at the cake smeared across Emma's face. Then she turned to me with eyes empty of any grandmotherly warmth. Now you lick it off from her face. More laughter. Greg had finally looked up from his phone to chuckle. My father had shaken his head with a smile like I was the punchline to a joke he'd heard before. Madison had been grinning triumphantly. Something fundamental had broken in me then. I grabbed Emma, holding her protective against my chest. Her head lolled against my shoulder, and I'd started moving toward the door. They could laugh. They could mock. I was getting my daughter out of this house of horrors. Before leaving, clean all this mess. My father had shouted after me. Finish what you started. Victoria had said, rushing to block the doorway with a grin still on her face. I'd pushed past her and left. The rest of that night had been the hospital, the police report I'd filed against my better judgment, and the slow realization that I'd finally reached my breaking point. Daniel had arrived at the hospital within an hour of my call. He'd taken one look at Emma's bruised face and the barely contained rage on mine and understood everything. He'd held me while I cried in a bathroom away from our daughter's room, letting years of accumulated hurt pour out. When I finished, he'd asked me one question. What do you want to do? What I wanted was justice. What I wanted was for them to hurt the way they'd hurt Emma. What I wanted was impossible, to go back in time and never subject my daughter to these people. I want them to understand consequences, I'd finally said. Over the next 3 days while Emma recovered at home, Daniel and I made plans. I'd already filed a police report. The officer, a woman named Detective Sarah Martinez, had been sympathetic but realistic. Pressing assault charges against a 6-year-old wouldn't go anywhere, but we could pursue charges against Victoria for failing to supervise and potentially for her actions with Emma's hair. The process would be long, difficult, and might not result in convictions. But it would be documented. It would be official. I did it anyway. Filed formal charges against Victoria. The look on her face when the police showed up at her house was worth every hour of paperwork. She'd called me immediately afterward, screaming that I was destroying the family over nothing, that Madison was just a child, that I was being vindictive and cruel. I'd let her rant until she ran out of breath. You grabbed my unconscious daughter's hair and mocked her, I'd said calmly. You encouraged your daughter to assault her. You laughed while my mother suggested I lick cake off her face. Those are the facts. What happens next is consequence. She'd hung up on me. My mother called next, then my father. Same script, different voices. I was overreacting, destroying family bonds over childish antics, being too sensitive, making Emma worse by coddling her. I listened to each of them and repeated the same response. Their actions had consequences. I was done protecting them from those consequences. The criminal case moved slowly. But I discovered something interesting through Detective Martinez. I could file a civil suit. Sue Victoria and my parents for Emma's medical bills, pain and suffering, emotional distress. Daniel had been hesitant about the cost, but I'd found a lawyer named Barbara Chen who worked on contingency. She'd taken one look at the medical records, the police report, and the documented history of family dysfunction and smiled grimly. "We can work with this," she'd said. The lawsuit hit them like a hurricane. I wasn't asking for millions, just $15,000 to cover Emma's medical expenses, therapy costs, and punitive damages. A small amount in the grand scheme of things. But for my middle-class family who prided themselves on respectability and privacy, the public nature of a lawsuit was devastating. Their friends found out. Their church community learned what happened. Victoria's employer got wind of it when court documents became public record. The story made local news, not front page, but enough that people in our mid-sized Pennsylvania town noticed. Local family suit over child's birthday party assault wasn't the kind of headline that disappeared quietly. My mother tried reaching out through extended family members. Aunts and uncles I barely spoke to suddenly called with messages about forgiveness and family unity. I told each of them the same thing: they were welcome to read the police report and medical records if they wanted to understand what forgiveness they were asking me to extend. Most stopped calling after that. Victoria's world crumbled in ways I hadn't anticipated. Her husband Greg, who'd been checked out during the actual incident, suddenly cared very much about his reputation. He filed for divorce 3 months after the lawsuit was served, citing Victoria's behavior and the legal problems as evidence of an unstable home environment. He fought for full custody of Madison, painting Victoria as an unfit mother who encouraged violence in children. I felt complicated about that. Madison was 6. She'd been raised by wolves and taught that cruelty was entertainment. She needed help, not punishment. But Greg's lawyers used every piece of evidence from Emma's party to build their case. The custody battle got nasty in ways that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the foundation of cruelty Victoria had built her life on. My parents tried to settle the lawsuit out of court. Barbara advised me that their offer, $5,000 and a promise to never contact us again, was insulting but potentially practical. We could take it, put this behind us, and move on. I thought about it for exactly one night before declining. "We're going to trial," I told Barbara. "I want them to sit in a courtroom and have their actions read aloud by a judge." Trial came 11 months after Emma's birthday. She was 5 now, in kindergarten, and had spent months in play therapy working through trauma from that day. She still flinched when people approached her with food. She had nightmares about family gatherings. Her therapist, Dr. Williams, had documented all of this meticulously. The courtroom was small and smelled like old wood and desperation. My family sat on one side, Victoria with her lawyer, my parents with theirs. I sat on the other with Daniel beside me, his hand wrapped around mine. Emma stayed with Daniel's mother, thankfully spared from having to appear. Barbara was methodical and devastating. She presented the medical records showing Emma's concussion. She read from the police report, Detective Martinez's notes describing the scene and my statement. She introduced testimony from Dr. Richardson, who explained the severity of head injuries in small children and how lucky Emma had been. She showed bills totaling $8,000 for emergency care, follow-up appointments, and ongoing therapy. Then she addressed the assault itself. She described, in clinical detail, how Madison had slammed Emma's head into the cake with enough force to cause unconsciousness. How Victoria had grabbed Emma's hair afterward. How my mother had suggested I lick frosting from my daughter's face. She read these facts in a level voice while the judge's expression grew increasingly disturbed. Victoria's lawyer tried to argue childish roughhousing. Barbara countered with Dr. Williams' testimony about Emma's ongoing trauma, her changed behavior, her fear of family. She argued that Victoria's post-assault actions, the hair-grabbing, the mockery, demonstrated this wasn't accidental play but deliberate cruelty. My parents' lawyer argued they hadn't physically touched Emma and therefore bore no responsibility. Barbara presented testimony I'd given about years of enabling Victoria's behavior, about their laughter during the assault, about my father's demand that I clean up and my mother's degrading command. She framed it as a family system built on dysfunction and abuse that had finally escalated to violence. The trial lasted 3 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Judge Patricia Thornton delivered her ruling. She found Victoria liable for negligent supervision and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She found my parents liable as property owners who failed to intervene in an assault occurring in their home and for their post-assault conduct. She awarded Emma the full $15,000 plus court costs. My hands had been shaking when the judge read her decision. Daniel squeezed my fingers so hard I felt his wedding ring press into my skin. Across the courtroom, Victoria's face had gone ashen. My father's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the victim even now. Barbara had warned me they might appeal. The amount wasn't huge, but the principle would sting. People like my parents didn't accept being told they were wrong, especially not publicly by a judge. We prepared for a longer fight if necessary. But 3 weeks after the judgment, their lawyer contacted Barbara about payment arrangements. They were accepting the ruling rather than dragging it out further. Why? I'd asked Barbara during our call. That doesn't seem like them. Their lawyer probably advised them that an appeal would mean more publicity, Barbara had explained. More testimony. More details in public record. Sometimes people cut their losses. The checks had arrived in separate envelopes. One from Victoria for $5,000. One from my parents for $10,000 plus court costs. No letters accompanied them. No apologies or explanations. Just payment of a debt they'd been legally forced to acknowledge. I'd stared at those checks for a long time before depositing them. They represented something I'd never imagined possible, my family being held accountable, being made to pay literally for damage they'd caused. The numbers on those checks were admission, however unwilling, that they'd been wrong and I'd been right to fight back. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory came when Judge Thornton spent 5 minutes delivering what amounted to a lecture on family responsibility and child welfare. She said the behavior described in testimony was unconscionable, deliberately cruel, and indicative of a family culture that prizes cruelty over kindness. She said my parents had failed in their most basic duty to protect a vulnerable child. She said Victoria had demonstrated stunning callousness toward her niece's well-being. My mother cried in the courtroom. My father's face turned purple with rage. Victoria stared at the table in front of her like she could disappear through force of will. I sat there feeling nothing except relief that this chapter was finally closing. The money from the judgment went into a trust fund for Emma, designated for her future education and continued therapy needs. I didn't want to spend it on anything else. It wasn't money won, it was compensation for damage inflicted. The real satisfaction came in smaller moments over the following months. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my parents had become social pariahs in their church community. People who'd known them for decades pulled away after learning what happened. My mother, who derived so much of her identity from being a pillar of the community, found herself uninvited from committees and gatherings. One afternoon about 6 months after the trial, I'd run into Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store. She'd been in my parents' Bible study group for 20 years, a woman my mother considered a close friend. When she saw me, she'd approached immediately, her face full of concern. "Jennifer, I had no idea what your mother was really like," she'd said quietly, glancing around to make sure nobody was listening. When the story came out about Emma's party, I couldn't believe it at first. But then other people started sharing their own experiences with how your mother treated people. Small cruelties they'd overlooked because she seemed so respectable. I just nodded, unsure what to say. Mrs. Patterson had continued, her voice dropping even lower. "I want you to know that several of us have stopped associating with your parents. What happened to your little girl was unforgivable. I'm so sorry we didn't see it sooner. Your mother always spoke so dismissively about you, but we thought it was just her sense of humor. We were wrong to excuse it." The validation had been unexpected and overwhelming. I thanked her and left quickly before I could start crying in the cereal aisle. Strangers and acquaintances believing me, supporting me, choosing Emma's well-being over maintaining comfortable relationships with my parents, it meant more than I could articulate. Daniel had noticed the change in me that evening. "Something happened today," he'd said, not quite a question. I told him about Mrs. Patterson and watched his expression soften. "People are seeing the truth," he'd said simply. Finally. Victoria's custody battle with Greg ended with split custody but mandatory supervised visitation. She'd have to rebuild her relationship with Madison under the watchful eye of court-appointed monitors. Her reputation in our town was demolished. The teaching position she'd held at a private elementary school quietly didn't renew her contract. I felt varying degrees of satisfaction about all of this. Mostly I felt tired. Vindicated but exhausted. The process of holding them accountable had been draining in ways I hadn't anticipated. Worth it, but hard. Emma turned 6 2 years after the incident. We celebrated at a trampoline park with her school friends, none of whom knew anything about what had happened at her fourth birthday. She jumped and laughed and ate pizza and cake without any trauma responses. Daniel and I watched her, both of us knowing we'd made the right choices even when they'd been difficult. Her teacher, Miss Caroline, had pulled me aside during pickup the week before the party. "I wanted to tell you that Emma is such a compassionate child," she'd said warmly. "Yesterday another student fell and scraped his knee, and Emma immediately got him ice from the nurse. She sat with him until he felt better." Pride had swelled in my chest. Despite everything she'd been through, Emma was growing into someone kind. Someone who noticed when others were hurting and tried to help. She hadn't inherited the cruelty that ran through my family's veins like poison. We'd broken that cycle. The birthday party itself had been simple and joyful. 10 kids running around, burning energy on trampolines while parents chatted nearby. Emma's cake had been covered in rainbow sprinkles, her current obsession. When we'd sung happy birthday, she'd grin so wide her whole face lit up. She'd blown out her candles in one breath and clapped for herself. Later, after presents were opened and friends had gone home, Emma had climbed into my lap during the car ride. "That was the best birthday ever," she'd said sleepily, her head resting against my shoulder. Daniel had met my eyes in the rearview mirror. His expression held relief and satisfaction and love. We'd given her what she deserved: celebration without fear, joy without cruelty, a childhood where birthdays meant happiness instead of trauma. My family made no attempts to contact us. The judge's ruling had included a recommendation for no contact until Emma was old enough to decide for herself whether she wanted a relationship with them. I'd been granted what amounted to a legal excuse to do what I should have done years ago: cut them out completely. Sometimes I wondered if I'd been too harsh. If destroying their reputations and relationships had been proportional to what they'd done. Those doubts usually came late at night when everything felt uncertain. Then I'd remember Emma's limp body in my arms, the frosting covering her unconscious face, my mother's command to lick it off, and the doubts would evaporate. They'd hurt my child. They'd laughed about it. They'd tried to make me complicit in humiliating her. There was no overreaction to that. There was only response. Daniel's family became our family. His mother, Carol, treated Emma with a grandmother warmth mine never had. His sister Rachel threw Emma birthday parties filled with genuine joy and celebration. We built traditions that had nothing to do with the Brooks family and their poisonous dynamics. 3 years after the incident, I got a letter from my mother. It had been forwarded through Barbara, respecting the no-contact boundaries. In it, my mother wrote about regret and misunderstanding. She claimed she hadn't realized how serious things were, that she'd thought everyone was just having fun, that families sometimes played rough. She asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss reconciliation. I read the letter twice before putting it in a drawer. There was no apology in it. No actual acknowledgement that she'd stood by while her granddaughter was assaulted and then demanded I degrade myself. Just excuses and reframing and a request for access she burned any right to. I wrote back through Barbara. One paragraph. "Your actions at Emma's 4th birthday party demonstrated who you are. The trial and its aftermath confirmed it. Emma deserves family who protect her, not people who hurt her and laugh about it. We will not be meeting. Please don't contact us again." I never heard from her after that. Victoria reached out once through a mutual acquaintance, asking if I'd let her see Emma again. She promised she'd changed, that therapy had helped her understand her mistakes. I declined. Madison was welcome to contact Emma when they were both adults if she wanted a relationship with her cousin. Until then, I saw no reason to expose my daughter to someone who'd enabled and participated in her assault. People sometimes asked if I felt guilty about how everything ended. If I regretted tearing the family apart. The answer was complicated. I regretted that Emma had been hurt. I regretted believing my family could be different than they'd always been. I regretted not protecting her better. But I didn't regret holding them accountable. I didn't regret the lawsuit, the trial, the public exposure of their cruelty. Actions had consequences. They'd spent my entire life teaching me that my feelings didn't matter, that cruelty was acceptable entertainment, that family loyalty meant accepting abuse. They'd learned, finally, that they were wrong. Emma grew up healthy and kind. She became the sort of child who defended other kids on the playground, who noticed when someone was left out and invited them in. She had no memory of her extended family beyond vague impressions and the story we told her in age-appropriate ways as she got older. We'd been honest without being cruel. Some family members had hurt her when she was little, so we'd chosen to keep her safe by not seeing them anymore. She'd asked a few questions over the years. Why didn't she have grandparents like her friends? What happened at her 4th birthday? We'd answered honestly each time, always emphasizing that what happened wasn't her fault, that she'd done nothing wrong, that protecting her was our job and we'd failed initially but corrected course. On her 10th birthday, she asked if she could donate some of her trust fund money to an organization that helped kids in foster care. The irony wasn't lost on me, the money from her assault judgment going to help other children escape bad family situations. We'd worked with Barbara to make it happen, setting up a donation that would continue annually. Daniel and I built a life defined not by what we'd escaped but by what we'd created. We'd moved to a different town 3 years after the trial, wanting a fresh start where nobody knew our history. He'd gotten promoted to regional manager for the hardware chain. I'd gone back to school and become a family counselor, specializing in helping people navigate difficult relationships with relatives. The work felt meaningful. I helped other people set boundaries I'd learned too late. I taught them that family obligation didn't mean accepting abuse. I showed them that protecting their children was more important than maintaining poisonous relationships. Every client who successfully cut off a toxic family member felt like a small victory, proof that the cycle could break. Sometimes former clients would see me around town with Emma and recognize the strength in how we interacted. The easy affection, the genuine laughter, the security she felt with me. They'd comment on what good work I'd done raising her. I'd thank them and think about how close I'd come to failing her entirely, how I'd almost let family loyalty override maternal instinct. The story of what happened at Emma's 4th birthday became something I shared selectively in professional settings. Conferences about family systems and trauma. Workshops on protecting children from relatives. I'd tell it clinically, focusing on warning signs and intervention points. I'd talk about how normalized cruelty becomes invisible until something forces you to see it clearly. I never mentioned the satisfaction of watching them face consequences. That felt too personal, too vindictive. But I felt it nonetheless. Every time I heard through distant connections that Victoria was struggling or my parents had moved to another state to escape their reputation, I felt a grim contentment. Not happiness, I wasn't happy they'd suffered. But satisfaction that they'd learned actions had weight. Emma graduated high school and got accepted to a good college on the opposite coast. She wanted distance, fresh start, new experiences. Daniel and I helped her pack, both of us proud and terrified in equal measure. The night before she left, she'd hug me tight and thank me for always protecting her. "I know it cost you," she'd said quietly. "Cutting off your family. The lawsuit. Everything. You're my family," I told her. "Protecting you never cost anything that mattered." She pulled back and looked at me with those serious eyes she'd had even as a small child. "I want you to know I'm glad you did what you did. That you didn't let them get away with it." I'd started crying then, overwhelmed by gratitude that she understood. That she'd grown into someone who valued justice and boundaries and self-protection. That breaking the cycle had worked. Years continued passing. Daniel and I grew older together, our marriage strengthened by having faced crisis as partners rather than adversaries. We traveled. We volunteered. We built relationships with Daniel's extended family and friends we'd chosen deliberately. We created the life we wanted rather than the one we'd been handed. Emma built her own life across the country, checking in regularly and visiting when she could. She became a social worker, unsurprisingly, focusing on children's welfare. She met someone kind who treated her well. She thrived in ways that felt like vindication for every difficult choice I'd made. My mother died when Emma was 23. I got the news through a cousin I barely knew. There was an invitation to the funeral. I didn't go. Neither did Emma. We spent that day together instead, talking about grief for complicated relationships and finding peace with imperfect resolutions. She'd asked if I regretted not reconciling before my mother died. No, I'd said honestly. She never actually apologized. Never took responsibility. Reconciliation without accountability is just accepting mistreatment again. Emma had nodded understanding. She'd grown up healthy precisely because I'd been willing to burn bridges that needed burning. Victoria reached out one final time after my mother's funeral. She sent a long email about how our mother's death had made her reflect on family and regret. She wanted to meet, she said. To explain herself. To apologize properly. To try to build something with a niche she'd wronged so badly. I'd sat with that email for a week before responding. In the end, my answer was brief. You hurt my daughter deliberately. You mocked her trauma. You taught your daughter cruelty. I'm glad you're reflecting on your choices, but that doesn't obligate me to give you access to Emma or myself. I hope you find peace, but you won't find it through us. She'd written back, angry this time. Accusing me of holding grudges, of being unable to forgive, of using Emma as a weapon. I deleted it without finishing. There was nothing she could say that would change the fundamental reality. She'd shown me exactly who she was at Emma's 4th birthday party, and I'd finally believed her. Some wounds don't heal. Some bridges stay burned. Some consequences last forever. I made peace with all of that. Emma's childhood had been protected. Her safety had been prioritized. The people who'd hurt her had faced real repercussions for their actions. That was enough. In the end, what I did next after that horrible birthday party was simple. I chose my daughter over people who shared my blood but not my values. I used every legal and social tool available to hold them accountable. I refused to let them rug sweep their cruelty. I built a new life deliberately free from their dysfunction. They'd expected me to clean their mess, to finish what I started, to fall in line the way I always had before. Instead, I'd walked out carrying my daughter to safety and never looked back except to ensure they couldn't follow. The revenge they never saw coming wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was steady, persistent accountability that eroded their comfortable lives bit by bit until they understood, finally, that hurting people had costs. Emma's 4th birthday had been destroyed by people who should have protected her. But every birthday after had been filled with love, safety, and joy precisely because I'd been willing to do what needed doing. That was what I did next, everything necessary to ensure my daughter never experienced that cruelty again. And I'd do it all again without hesitation if faced with the same choice.